Have you ever imagined hearing the voice of your parent for the last time, knowing that the words spoken could change everything, yet feeling completely powerless to act? That was the moment Tracy Reiner faced, a moment etched in horror, grief, and disbelief. Her father, Rob Reiner, a man known for his larger-than-life presence and contributions to the entertainment world, had reached out to her in what would become a final, haunting conversation. A conversation that carried a warning so chilling, so precise, that it now resonates through the corridors of public fascination and private heartbreak. If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me? The weight of those words, laden with fear, mistrust, and love, would come to define the tragic saga of the Reiner family. Rob Reiner, 78, and his beloved wife Michelle, 70, were not just prominent figures in their circles. They were parents, friends, mentors, and by all appearances, the pillars of a family bound together by decades of shared memories and achievements. They lived in Brentwood, California, a neighborhood synonymous with luxury, privacy, and exclusivity. Their estate, valued at $13.5 million, was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of safety and comfort, yet it became the site of unimaginable violence. Within its walls, the life they had meticulously built was abruptly destroyed, leaving behind questions that the world is still struggling to answer. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The tragedy began to unfold in the most horrifying way imaginable. On a seemingly ordinary Sunday, both Rob and Michelle were found stabbed to death, victims of a crime that shocked not only their family but the wider public. In a twist of dark irony, the alleged perpetrator was someone who had been living in the shadows of the household, their 32-year-old son, Nick Reiner, who resided in the guest house on the estate. The allegations against Nick are grave, 2 counts of first-degree murder. But this is not merely a tale of a crime. It is a story of betrayal, hidden resentments, and the shattering of trust within a family. The very people who were supposed to provide safety and love became the victims of an unimaginable act of violence. The discovery of the bodies adds another layer of horror. Reports indicate that Romy, the Reiner's 27-year-old daughter, was the one who found her parents. She immediately raised alarms, pointing to a family member she described as dangerous, a chilling suggestion that her brother, Nick, might be involved. The emotional impact of that moment is impossible to overstate. Imagine walking into your family home, expecting the warmth of familiarity, only to encounter the grotesque aftermath of betrayal. The shock, the fear, and the helplessness Romy must have felt are beyond comprehension, yet it was she who had to step into the role of truth-bearer, alerting authorities to the nightmarish reality. But before this nightmare reached its tragic climax, there was a moment, a final line spoken by a father to a daughter, heavy with foreboding. Tracy Reiner, likely unaware of the storm approaching, received that last call from Rob. Those words, simple in structure but monumental in implication, revealed a profound sense of awareness, a knowledge of potential danger lurking within their family circle. How did Rob know something was amiss? What could have driven him to utter such a specific and pointed warning? The human mind struggles to grasp the complexity of anticipating betrayal from one's own child, yet here it was. A premonition that would soon prove tragically accurate. To understand the gravity of this story, it is essential to place it within the context of the Reiner family's life. Rob Reiner, beyond his familial identity, was a public figure whose career spanned decades, whose contributions to film and television left indelible marks on culture. Michelle, his partner in life and love, shared in that public presence while nurturing their children and maintaining a family environment that appeared harmonious, at least outwardly. The image presented to the world was one of stability, of warmth and care. Yet appearances, as so often in life, can be deceiving. Beneath the surface lay fractures, resentments, and perhaps motivations that are still only partially understood. The contrast between public perception and private reality is one of the most compelling and horrifying aspects of this tragedy. As news of the murders spread, public fascination grew. It is a natural human response to try to make sense of chaos, to understand why someone would commit an act so egregiously violent against those they were meant to love. Speculation, media scrutiny, and social media discourse quickly swirled around the case, each new detail feeding the curiosity gap. Yet behind the headlines, the emotional core of this story remains human. A family destroyed, a daughter left grappling with grief and fear, a community shaken by the notion that such violence can originate from within the walls of one's own home. The story compels us not merely because of its sensational aspects, but because it touches on universal fears, the betrayal of trust, the vulnerability of loved ones, the fragility of life itself. The warning in Rob's final words to Tracy is especially poignant because it encapsulates both love and fear. If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me? Those words reveal a man acutely aware of risk, someone who understood the dangerous undercurrents within his family dynamics. They hint at knowledge, perhaps of past behavior, perhaps of subtle signs that only a parent could detect, that something could go horribly wrong. They are words meant to protect, yet they are ultimately powerless to stop the impending tragedy. And therein lies the cruel irony of the narrative. Foresight without the ability to act is one of the most excruciating forms of helplessness. Yet there is another layer to consider, the role of Romy in discovering the truth. It is not just a matter of witnessing the crime scene. It is about facing the psychological trauma of realizing that the threat came from a brother, someone she should have been able to trust implicitly. Her quick thinking in alerting authorities shows bravery, resilience, and presence of mind under circumstances that would overwhelm most people. The juxtaposition of horror and courage in her actions adds another emotional dimension to the story, reinforcing both the tragedy and the human capacity for response under unimaginable stress. This story also resonates because it touches on themes that are universally relatable: family, trust, betrayal, and the limits of our knowledge about those closest to us. We like to believe we know our loved ones, that we can predict their behavior, and that the bonds of family provide safety against the worst outcomes. Yet the Reiner case shatters that assumption, revealing that even in families perceived as stable and loving, hidden tensions can escalate into irreversible tragedy. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Could we ever anticipate such betrayal? How well do we really know those we hold dearest? And what do we do when intuition warns us of danger we cannot control? As the story unfolds, we will examine not only the events of that fateful Sunday, but also the complex dynamics that preceded it. We will look into Nick's life, his relationship with his parents and siblings, and the subtle signs that hinted at potential danger. We will explore the investigation, the discovery of the bodies, and the broader implications for both the family and the community. Each chapter will peel back another layer, revealing the interplay of love, fear, resentment, and tragedy that culminated in the events that shocked the nation. And yet, despite the horror, there is a thread of humanity that persists. Tracy's experience, Romy's courage, the legacy of Rob and Michelle. All of these remind us that even in the darkest moments, human emotion, resilience, and memory endure. It is a story that evokes tears, reflection, and a deep understanding of how fragile life and trust can be. It is a story that compels us to question, to empathize, and to engage, not simply as spectators of a crime, but as witnesses to the profound complexities of family and human behavior. But the most pressing question remains: how did things unravel so catastrophically, and could it have been prevented? What were the hidden tensions that led to such a violent outcome? And what can we learn from this unimaginable betrayal? As we move forward into the chapters ahead, we will begin to uncover these layers, piece by piece, following the timeline, the emotions, and the shocking revelations that define this tragic tale. And in doing so, we will come face to face with a story that is as heartbreaking as it is compelling, one that will leave no viewer untouched by its emotional resonance. What happened in that Brentwood estate is more than just a headline. It is a window into the delicate balance of family, trust, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Rob Reiner's final words to Tracy were not just a warning. They were a plea, a final attempt to protect what he could, even in the face of the unimaginable. As we delve into this story, we will explore the moments leading up to the tragedy, the intricate family dynamics, and the aftermath that continues to ripple through the lives of those involved. And as the details unfold, one thing becomes clear. The Reiner family story is a haunting reminder that even the strongest bonds can be shattered in an instant, and that the human heart is capable of both extraordinary love and devastating betrayal. The introduction concludes here, but the tension is only just beginning. What Romy discovered, what Tracy now carries in her memory, and what led to Nick's alleged actions are still shrouded in mystery, waiting to be unraveled. The next chapters will dive deep into the life of Nick, the family history, and the night that changed everything. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Imagine a family that seemed to have it all: success, love, and prestige. To the outside world, Rob and Michelle Reiner were the embodiment of accomplishment and stability. Rob, at 78, was more than just a father and husband. He was a household name, a cultural force whose career in film and television had influenced generations. From directing iconic movies to championing social causes, his life was a mosaic of achievements and accolades. Michelle, 70, shared in his journey, balancing the demands of public life while nurturing a family that appeared to flourish in the spotlight. On the surface, theirs was a story of triumph, of partnership, of a household that seemed unbreakable. But appearances, as history and tragedy often teach us, can be deceiving. The Reiner family's roots in Los Angeles were deeply intertwined with the entertainment world. Rob's father, Carl Reiner, had laid the groundwork for a legacy that was both celebrated and scrutinized. Growing up in such an environment meant that Rob himself was accustomed to public attention, to expectations, and to a life that blurred the lines between private and public. Yet while he embraced the limelight professionally, he seemed committed to creating a private sanctuary for his own family. The Brentwood estate, sprawling and meticulously maintained, was more than a home. It was a fortress designed to shield those he loved from the outside world. And for years, it seemed to work. Within the walls of this estate, Michelle and Rob raised their children, Tracy, Romy, and Nick. Tracy, the eldest, was known for her grounded personality, often described as thoughtful, intelligent, and emotionally perceptive. Romy, at 27, carried a sharp sense of responsibility, with a courage that would later define her in ways none of them could have anticipated. And then there was Nick, the youngest, a 32-year-old whose presence in the household's guest house seemed unremarkable at first glance, yet whose future would irrevocably alter the family's narrative. Each child carried a part of the Reiner legacy, but also the complexities and pressures of living under the shadow of a highly accomplished father. Publicly, the family maintained an image of cohesion. Photographs of smiling faces, vacations, and gatherings painted a picture of a family united by love and shared memories. But in private, the Reiners were not immune to tension, disagreement, or the subtle undercurrents that can quietly erode familial bonds. While no one could have predicted the events that would later unfold, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible hints of discord, that hinted at deeper issues beneath the polished surface. Perhaps it was the way disagreements were handled behind closed doors, or the occasional expressions of frustration that never reached the public eye. Perhaps it was something more intangible, a sense that even in seemingly perfect families, fractures can develop unnoticed until it is too late. One of the most striking aspects of the Reiner family dynamic was the balance between public expectation and private reality. Rob Reiner's achievements cast a long shadow, and it is natural for children to feel pressure, consciously or unconsciously, under such circumstances. Tracy, as the eldest, seemed to navigate this balance with relative ease, but Nick's role in the household was more complicated. Living in the guest house, slightly removed from the main family sphere, he was both part of the family and on the periphery, a position that may have contributed to feelings of isolation, resentment, or inadequacy. Family psychologists often point out that living arrangements and perceived favoritism can influence sibling relationships in profound ways. And in the Reiner household, these dynamics may have played a significant role. The estate itself was more than a backdrop. It was a character in the story. Every hallway, every room, every meticulously landscaped garden reflected the values of those who lived there. It was a home designed for both comfort and security, Yet in an ironic twist of fate, it became the stage for the most unthinkable act. The very walls meant to protect the Reiners ultimately witnessed their destruction. This juxtaposition between safety and vulnerability is central to understanding the tragedy that unfolded, a reminder that even the most fortified environments cannot always shield us from human betrayal. Rob and Michelle's parenting style, as recounted by friends and acquaintances, blended encouragement with discipline, affection with expectation. They were loving, yet firm, nurturing, yet cognizant of life's realities. They instilled values of responsibility, integrity, and empathy, qualities that one would assume provided a moral compass for their children. But even the best-intentioned upbringing cannot eliminate the complexities of human emotion, the struggles with jealousy, entitlement, or suppressed anger that can quietly fester within a family. What may have seemed like minor disputes or disagreements were, in retrospect, early indicators of deeper fractures, a foreshadowing of the events that would culminate in tragedy. The Reiner children themselves were navigating adulthood, each facing their own challenges, ambitions, and frustrations. Tracy, Romy, and Nick were all adults, capable of making their own decisions, yet still tethered to the emotional gravity of their parents' influence. Family dynamics do not vanish when children grow up. They evolve, often revealing hidden tensions and unresolved conflicts. In the case of the Reiners, these evolving dynamics would intersect in catastrophic ways, ultimately bringing to light questions of loyalty, trust, and moral responsibility. An important element of understanding the Reiner family legacy is recognizing the duality of public perception versus private reality. Rob Reiner, celebrated for his career and social contributions, was a man admired by millions. Michelle, supportive, loving, and poised, complemented this image. To outsiders, the family seemed idyllic, a model of success and unity. Yet, as is often true in human narratives, the surface can conceal a far more complex and sometimes darker reality. This duality creates tension, not only within the family but also for those observing it, and sets the stage for the shocking events that were to come. As we reflect on the Reiner family legacy, it becomes clear that this story is about more than fame or fortune. It is about the fragile bonds of trust that hold families together, the subtle currents of emotion that can either strengthen or weaken these bonds, and the consequences when those currents are ignored or misunderstood. The tragedy that unfolded in Brentwood is a stark reminder that no amount of money, fame, or public admiration can insulate a family from the complexities of human behavior and the devastating consequences of betrayal. The introduction of Nick as the youngest child, residing in the guest house, begins to hint at the underlying tensions that may have existed within the household. His proximity to the family, coupled with his separate living space, could have contributed to feelings of isolation or resentment, a theme that would later become central to understanding the events of that fateful Sunday. While the public image of the family was one of unity and success, the private reality, as often happens in high-pressure environments, may have been far more complicated, filled with unspoken conflicts, rivalries, and grievances that simmered beneath the surface. As the narrative continues, it is crucial to recognize that the Reiner family legacy is not solely defined by tragedy. There is a history of love, accomplishment, and resilience that shaped the family, providing context for the human dimensions of the story. It is precisely this contrast between the family's celebrated achievements and the horrifying circumstances of their deaths that heightens the emotional impact of the tale. The story becomes not just about a crime, but about the vulnerabilities inherent in all families and the unpredictability of human behavior even in households that appear perfect from the outside. In exploring the Reiner family legacy, we begin to understand the pressures, expectations, and dynamics that may have influenced the events that followed. The interplay of personality, upbringing, and environmental factors created a complex emotional ecosystem within the household. Understanding this ecosystem is essential for making sense of the tragedy and appreciating the depth of the human drama involved. It allows us to see beyond the headlines and into the intricate web of relationships, loyalties, and conflicts that define family life, even among those who appear to have everything. And yet, for all the analysis and reflection, the Reiner family story retains an element of mystery and shock. How did a household that seemed so stable, so loving, and so accomplished unravel into a scene of horror? What factors, hidden from public view, contributed to the events that led to the murders? These questions will guide the unfolding narrative as we explore the lives of the children, the relationships within the family, and the specific moments that culminated in tragedy. Each revelation will bring us closer to understanding the unimaginable breach of trust that defined the Reiner story. The story of the Reiner family legacy concludes this chapter with a sobering realization. Even the strongest family bonds are not impervious to conflict, betrayal, or tragedy. The careful construction of reputation, wealth, and social stature cannot safeguard against the unpredictable complexities of human behavior. As we transition to the next chapter, we will focus on the youngest member of the family, Nick Reiner, whose role in the household and subsequent alleged actions are central to understanding the unfolding tragedy. Every family has its dynamics, its secrets, its shadows. In the Reiner household, those shadows took shape in the form of Nick Reiner, the youngest child whose presence would later become the axis of one of the most shocking tragedies in recent memory. Nick, 32, lived in the guest house on the Brentwood estate, a detail that seems mundane at first, but one that gains chilling significance as the events unfold. The guest house represented both proximity and separation. He was close enough to witness family life, yet apart enough to cultivate a private world of his own, hidden from the eyes of his parents and siblings. This duality, in retrospect, may have been a factor in the dark path his life would allegedly take. Nick's childhood and upbringing were, by most accounts, similar to that of his siblings. Love, education, opportunity, and exposure to a family steeped in prominence and accomplishment. Yet even in the most seemingly nurturing environments, children absorb and respond to subtleties of family dynamics in profoundly different ways. While Tracy and Romy grew into personalities marked by empathy, responsibility, and resilience, Nick's trajectory hinted at complexities that would later manifest tragically. Friends and acquaintances describe him as intelligent but private, occasionally withdrawn, sometimes volatile, traits that, when combined with unaddressed resentment or perceived favoritism, can create a volatile psychological cocktail. Living in the guest house provided Nick with a curious position within the family ecosystem. On one hand, he had independence, a space to explore his own interests and life choices. On the other, that separation may have fostered a sense of exclusion or even an emotional distance from the family core. Experts in family psychology often note that such arrangements can subtly exacerbate feelings of alienation, especially when combined with the pressures of living in a household that carries both fame and high expectations. While these nuances might seem trivial to outsiders, in family tragedies, minor perceived slights can accumulate into profound psychological tension. Nick's relationship with his parents, particularly with his father, Rob, was complex. Rob, a man of intellect and charisma, was deeply involved in his children's lives, but the attention he gave naturally carried implicit expectations. Nick's final actions, alleged though they may be, suggest a long-standing conflict or dissatisfaction that may have been hidden from public view. The layers of his relationship with Rob were likely shaped by admiration, resentment, dependency, and perhaps a yearning for validation. A combination that, if mismanaged, can erupt into destructive behavior. While the public knew only a glimpse of Nick's persona, the private reality was far more intricate, threaded with emotion, ambition, and, ultimately, peril. Friends and family described Nick as someone whose mood swings could shift rapidly. Outwardly calm, or even charming, he was capable of intense emotional outbursts behind closed doors. These glimpses of volatility, often overlooked in families or rationalized as personality quirks, may have been early warning signs of deeper unrest. In many familial tragedies, patterns of subtle aggression, secrecy, or resentment are present long before violence erupts, and the Reiner family appears to have been no exception. The guest house, meant to be a comfortable space for an adult child, may have inadvertently become a crucible where frustration, isolation, and hidden conflict simmered unseen. Nick's role in the family was also marked by economic considerations. In families of wealth and inheritance, the perception of entitlement, or lack thereof, can stir profound emotions. Rob Reiner's final words to Tracy: "If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me?" Hint at a recognition of potential financial conflict. That warning, spoken before the tragedy, underscores the depth of concern Rob had regarding his son's character or motivations. While the specifics of those concerns remain private, the existence of such a warning suggests a history of tension or behavior that raised alarms in his parents' minds. Financial disputes in families can exacerbate underlying emotional conflicts, and in this case, the intersection of money, trust, and power may have played a central role in the events that followed. As Nick transitioned into adulthood, his interactions with his siblings also reflected complexity. Tracy, the eldest, reportedly maintained a caring yet cautious relationship with him, always aware of the need to navigate delicate family dynamics. Romy, the youngest daughter, carried responsibility and perceptiveness, traits that would later place her at the center of the immediate discovery of tragedy. The contrast between Nick's behavior and that of his sisters highlights the diversity of emotional response within a family unit. While some members navigate stress and expectation with resilience, others struggle, sometimes dangerously, to manage feelings of inadequacy, resentment, or isolation. Nick's psychological profile, as inferred from public records and reports, suggests an individual who oscillated between charm and volatility. While it is important to note that we cannot diagnose without first-hand evaluation, patterns emerge when reviewing the history and context of the Reiner family. He was a man capable of thoughtful interaction, yet also potentially driven by hidden anger or perceived injustice. The dynamics of fame, wealth, and family expectation created a high-pressure environment that could amplify emotional instability, especially if underlying grievances were left unaddressed. On the day of the tragedy, Nick's position in the guest house made him uniquely poised to intersect with his family's lives in ways that would later have devastating consequences. Proximity allowed for access, yet distance allowed for detachment. A combination that experts often cite in familial crimes where access to victims coincides with emotional disconnection. In essence, the very arrangement designed to accommodate adult independence may have unwittingly facilitated a scenario in which underlying tensions could escalate unchecked. It is also critical to understand that Nick's life prior to the events of that fateful Sunday was largely private. Unlike his parents, whose careers and achievements were public, Nick existed largely outside the public eye. This relative obscurity creates a sense of mystery when tragic events thrust such individuals into the spotlight. The contrast between public perception and private reality becomes even starker, inviting questions about what went unnoticed, what was underestimated, and what warning signs may have been overlooked. The tragic outcome forces a retrospective examination of behaviors, interactions, and environmental factors that might have predicted the escalation of conflict. The family's interactions with Nick were likely shaped by both love and caution. Parents often struggle to balance protection with independence, affection with accountability. In households of wealth and status, these struggles are magnified by external expectations and scrutiny. It is plausible that Rob and Michelle were aware of challenges in Nick's behavior and sought to mitigate risks through guidance, rules, or financial boundaries. Rob's premonitory warning to Tracy suggests an acute awareness of potential danger, hinting that his concerns about Nick's disposition were long-standing and serious. Yet, even awareness cannot always prevent tragedy, particularly when emotional currents run deep and are left unresolved. Nick's relationship with money, inheritance, and perceived entitlement may have been central to family tensions. In wealthy households, disputes over inheritance are often not merely about money, but about validation, control, and acknowledgement. Rob's explicit instruction to Tracy indicates that he perceived a real risk of conflict in this domain. Such foresight, while prudent, underscores a tragic irony. Even when a parent anticipates danger and acts to prevent it, the complexities of human behavior can override protective intentions. The narrative of Nick as the hidden son is thus inseparable from the elements of access, opportunity, and the family's awareness of potential threat. What makes Nick's story particularly haunting is the duality of presence and absence. Present in the estate, yet emotionally absent. Part of the family, yet seemingly detached. This duality illustrates a broader truth about familial tragedy. Often, the individuals who cause the greatest harm are those whose motivations are hidden, whose resentments simmer in silence, and whose outward appearance conceals inner turmoil. In Nick's case, the guest house symbolized this duality, a physical manifestation of both inclusion and separation, ultimately setting the stage for the tragedy that would shock the world. By examining Nick Reiner's background, psychological profile, and position within the family, we begin to understand how a combination of environment, personality, and familial dynamics created the conditions for the events of that fateful day. This chapter paints a picture of a man whose presence was both ordinary and ominous, whose relationships with his parents and siblings were complex, and whose actions, alleged though they are, would irrevocably alter the family's narrative. As the next chapter will explore, the events of the night that changed everything were not merely the product of a single moment, but the culmination of years of unseen tension, subtle conflict, and emotional volatility. Nick's role, once peripheral, became central to a tragedy that no one could have fully anticipated. And as the story unfolds, the question remains, how did the life of the youngest Reiner child, hidden in the guest house, spiral into such horror? The answers lie ahead, in the night that would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It was supposed to be an ordinary Sunday evening at the Brentwood estate. The Reiner household, sprawling and meticulously maintained, was filled with the quiet rhythm of domestic life. Rob Reiner, at 78, and Michelle, at 70, were winding down, perhaps discussing mundane household matters, family news, or the week ahead. Outside, the California night was calm, the kind of evening that masks nothing and everything at once. Inside, however, a storm was quietly brewing. A storm that would erupt in a way that would shock not only the Reiner family but the entire world. By all appearances, the estate was serene. Guests were absent, the only occupants being the family themselves. Rob and Michelle were in the main house, living a life shaped by decades of love, effort, and shared memories. Nick, 32, resided in the guest house, a separate but nearby dwelling on the property. At first glance, the separation was practical, even normal for a grown adult. But that evening, the distance between the main house and the guest house would not serve as a buffer. It would provide access, opportunity, and proximity to the unimaginable. The night unfolded quietly, almost deceptively. There were no screams reported by neighbors, no signs of a struggle outside the estate, and no early warnings that would hint at the violence to come. Inside the home, however, tension escalated rapidly, though it was invisible to the world beyond the gates. Experts in family violence often note that domestic tragedies can appear calm on the surface even in the final, most critical moments. That night, the Reiner estate was a stage for precisely that kind of hidden terror. What we know about the timeline comes from both police reports and witness accounts, primarily from Romy, the youngest daughter. She would later recount how she discovered the bodies, a moment that no one should ever have to endure. The events leading up to that discovery, however, remain partially obscured, hidden in the shadows of fear, violence, and the chaos of the moment. Romy, who lived off-site or nearby, arrived at the estate expecting normalcy. Instead, she encountered a scene that would haunt her forever. The sequence of events, pieced together from reports, paints a picture of both premeditation and tragic immediacy. The attacks on Rob and Michelle were brutal, precise, and merciless. Reports indicate that both were stabbed to death, suggesting a level of intent and violence that transcends spontaneous rage. This was not an argument gone too far or a heated dispute that accidentally escalated. The nature of the injuries points to a deliberate act, a calculated strike against the people who had raised, nurtured, and loved the perpetrator, or, in this case, the alleged perpetrator of the crime. The discovery of the bodies by Romy added another layer of emotional intensity to the night. Imagine entering a home where you expect to find warmth and familiarity, only to find horror. The shock of that moment is nearly impossible to quantify. Romy reportedly called authorities immediately, providing critical details and identifying a family member she feared might be responsible. Her courage in the face of trauma is remarkable. Most individuals in such circumstances would be paralyzed by shock, unable to process the scene before them. Romy, however, acted decisively, alerting the authorities and setting in motion the investigation that would soon engulf the family and the public alike. While Romy's discovery is central, it is important to examine the atmosphere preceding the tragedy. Was there tension between Nick and his parents earlier in the day? Were there arguments, subtle threats, or gestures that might have foreshadowed the violence? Sources suggest that Rob had been aware of potential danger, as evidenced by his final warning to Tracy. This indicates a history of concern, a recognition that something was amiss within the family dynamic. The events of the night were not a sudden, isolated incident. They were the culmination of long-standing issues, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a catalyst to ignite them into action. Law enforcement quickly focused on Nick as a prime suspect, based on both circumstantial evidence and the reports provided by Romy. His proximity to the crime scene, combined with existing family tensions and prior warning signs, placed him squarely in the spotlight. Arrested that very night, Nick faced 2 counts of first-degree murder, charges that carry the heaviest consequences under the law. But while the legal system moved swiftly, the emotional aftermath for the surviving family members and the broader community was far more complicated. Families are rarely prepared to reconcile the notion that the violence came from someone they once trusted implicitly. The nature of the murders, stabbing, also carries symbolic and emotional weight. Unlike crimes committed from a distance, stabbing requires proximity, confrontation, and a direct engagement with the victim. This is not only a physically intimate act, but also an emotionally charged one. In cases where family members are the perpetrators, the symbolism is even more profound, a literal and figurative betrayal, a violent severing of the bond that should have been inviolable. For Tracy and Romy, understanding that their parents' lives were taken in such a personal, brutal manner is a source of profound trauma. As news of the murders reached the public, fascination and horror blended. Media coverage highlighted the fame of the Reiners, the wealth of their estate, and the shocking allegation that a son could commit such an act against his own parents. Social media exploded with speculation, discussion, and outrage, creating a feedback loop of attention and emotional intensity. Yet behind the headlines, the human story remained. A family torn apart, a daughter grappling with grief and disbelief, and a community struggling to comprehend the intersection of love, trust, and violence. The night of the murders also underscores the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Even in families that appear cohesive, with no overt signs of conflict, latent tensions can explode in catastrophic ways. It is a reminder that domestic violence does not always manifest through overt arguments or public disputes. It can be hidden, contained, and yet deadly when unleashed. The Reiner case is a chilling illustration of this principle, demonstrating how quickly normalcy can transform into horror when underlying conflicts are left unaddressed. The aftermath of the night would be felt immediately and long-term. Romy's heroism in discovering the bodies prevented further delay in law enforcement response, potentially containing additional risks. Tracy, upon learning of the events, was thrust into a maelstrom of grief and shock, forced to process the death of her parents alongside the horrifying reality of her brother's alleged involvement. Friends, neighbors, and the public were left to grapple with a story that defied logic, challenging assumptions about family, loyalty, and safety. And yet, even as we recount the night's events, a lingering question persists. Why did it escalate to this point? The warning Rob gave to Tracy before his death becomes ever more poignant, a haunting foreshadowing of a tragedy he may have sensed but could not prevent. This single conversation, laden with concern and fear, encapsulates the horror of the night, a father's awareness of danger, a daughter's receipt of a warning, and a family ultimately shattered despite foreknowledge. The night of the murders is a turning point in the Reiner family narrative, the moment where years of hidden tension, psychological complexity, and subtle conflict erupted into irreversible catastrophe. It sets the stage for the investigation, the unraveling of family secrets, and the exploration of Nick's motives, all of which will be examined in the chapters that follow. As the story progresses, we will peel back the layers of that evening, reconstruct the moments leading up to the discovery, and explore the human dimensions of grief, betrayal, and courage that defined it. Imagine receiving a phone call from your parent and knowing, without any doubt, that it would be the last time you ever heard their voice. That was the reality for Tracy Reiner. Moments before her life would be irreversibly changed. In that conversation, her father, Rob Reiner, spoke words that were simple in phrasing but monumental in meaning. "If anything happens to me, don't let Nick inherit a dime. You hear me?" Those words, laden with fear, foresight, and deep parental concern, were more than just a warning. They were a plea, a last attempt to protect his family from a threat he could sense but could not fully control. To understand the gravity of that moment, we must consider the context. Rob and Michelle had lived full, complex lives, balancing public acclaim with private devotion. Rob, 78, was a man whose career in film and television had made him an icon. Michelle, 70, had been his partner in every sense, supporting the family and contributing to the nurturing of their children. Together, they had cultivated a household that, to outsiders, appeared harmonious, loving, and secure. Yet within that home, the dynamics were far more complicated. Tensions simmered quietly, unseen by friends, colleagues, and the public. Nick, the youngest son, had long occupied a unique space within the household. Living in the guest house provided him both independence and separation. Yet this very arrangement may have contributed to feelings of isolation or resentment. Rob, acutely aware of potential issues. Tracy, at the receiving end of that call, likely felt a combination of shock, concern, and disbelief. To hear your father speak in such a direct, cautionary tone is jarring under any circumstances. But to do so moments before a horrific tragedy adds layers of emotional complexity that are difficult to articulate. That single call encapsulated the intersection of love, fear, and foreknowledge, revealing a man who, even in the face of danger, prioritized the safety and well-being of his children. The psychological weight of those words cannot be overstated. They carry with them not only the gravity of parental foresight, but also the harrowing acknowledgement of vulnerability. Rob's awareness of potential threats within his own family is a testament to his perceptiveness, but it also underscores a tragic truth. Foreknowledge does not always equate to prevention. Despite his efforts, despite the warning he gave, the events he feared came to pass, leaving Tracy to grapple with grief compounded by the haunting resonance of her father's last instructions. Experts in family dynamics often note that parental warnings, especially those made in moments of acute concern, can carry profound emotional and practical implications. Rob's choice to speak explicitly about Nick and inheritance issues indicates an understanding of both character and potential risk. It suggests that he had observed behaviors or attitudes that alarmed him, and he sought to mitigate potential harm by entrusting Tracy with protective responsibility. Such moments, while deeply emotional, are also fraught with moral and logistical challenges. How does one act on a warning when the threat is your own sibling? The call also illustrates the intersection of love and fear in parental guidance. Rob's love for his children was evident in every carefully chosen word. His concern for Tracy's ability to act, his attempt to safeguard the family legacy, and his explicit naming of a potential source of danger all reflect a deep understanding of both his children and the emotional stakes at hand. At the same time, the fear embedded in his tone foreshadows the imminent tragedy, casting a shadow over a relationship built on trust, affection, and shared history. This conversation, brief though it may have been, is now a central piece of the narrative. It provides insight into the family's internal dynamics, the relationship between parent and child, and the foreshadowing of events that would soon unfold. Tracy's perspective is crucial here. She is both the recipient of her father's final warning and a witness to the immediate aftermath of the violence. Her emotional journey, from receiving that call to confronting the horrifying reality moments later, is emblematic of the human capacity for shock, grief, and resilience in the face of incomprehensible loss. The stakes of that call were compounded by the timing and circumstances of the night. Rob and Michelle were in their home, moments away from being attacked. Nick, residing in the guest house, was in proximity, yet seemingly removed from the main household's interactions. This physical and emotional distance created a dynamic in which warning alone could not prevent tragedy. Tracy's receipt of the call highlights the tragic irony of the situation. Foreknowledge existed, but the means to act on it were limited, constrained by the rapid escalation of events that followed. The emotional resonance of Rob's last words extends beyond the immediate family. For those observing the tragedy from the outside, friends, neighbors, the public, the call underscores the fragility of trust within families. It reveals that even those who appear stable, loving, and secure can harbor underlying tensions potent enough to catalyze violence. The specificity of Rob's warning adds a chilling layer to this realization. He had identified a precise risk, yet even that insight could not avert catastrophe. In reflecting on the call, one must also consider the psychological burden placed on Tracy. She became the custodian of her father's last words, a responsibility that would weigh heavily as the investigation unfolded and as the public scrutinized the family's tragedy. The call positioned her at the intersection of grief, duty, and moral responsibility, highlighting the complex interplay between familial loyalty and the necessity of truth. How does one reconcile love for a sibling with the realization that the sibling may have committed an unimaginable act? These are questions that Tracy, like many in similar circumstances, is forced to confront with no clear answers. The call's content also illuminates the broader themes of inheritance, trust, and familial tension. Rob's concern about Nick inheriting a dime speaks not only to financial prudence, but also to an awareness of potential entitlement or grievance. Families of wealth often experience heightened emotional and interpersonal dynamics surrounding inheritance, but in this case, the concern transcends monetary considerations. It is entwined with questions of trust, moral judgment, and the protection of loved ones, issues that become tragically amplified in the aftermath of violence. Moreover, the call exemplifies the human instinct to protect, even when powerless. Rob's words were an attempt to exert influence over events beyond his immediate control, to create a safeguard for his children through instruction and forewarning. The poignancy of this act lies in its futility. Despite the care and urgency imbued in his words, the events he feared were set into motion. This tension between intention and outcome is at the heart of the tragedy, underscoring the limitations of human agency in the face of unforeseen or uncontrollable circumstances. As we reflect on the last call to Tracy, it becomes clear that it was more than a simple conversation. It was a microcosm of the Reiner family's complex dynamics, love intertwined with fear, trust challenged by potential betrayal, and protection hampered by circumstance. It encapsulates the emotional stakes, the moral dilemmas, and the tragic inevitability that would define the subsequent events of that night. The call also serves as a narrative pivot, connecting the personal with the imminent. It provides a lens through which we can understand the family's history, the psychological state of the youngest son, and the foresight of a father trying desperately to protect his children. As the investigation unfolds and more details emerge, the weight of that single conversation will continue to resonate, providing both clarity and emotional depth to the unfolding tragedy. Tracy's receipt of the call is the calm before the storm, a moment of clarity that underscores the impending horror. It frames the night not merely as an act of violence, but as a collision of foresight and fate. The warning was a prelude, a signal of awareness that, while tragically unheeded, illuminates the depth of familial concern and the human desire to shield loved ones from harm. As the story progresses, we will examine how this call intersected with the night's events, the discovery of the bodies, and the initial steps of law enforcement. Tracy's experience provides an emotional anchor, illustrating how love, fear, and responsibility converge in moments of crisis. And yet, even as the call concluded, the tragedy was only beginning to unfold. When the authorities arrived at the Brentwood estate that fateful Sunday night, they were stepping into a scene that would test the limits of both forensic science and human comprehension. The quiet, polished environment of the Reiner home. An estate that had symbolized security, wealth, and family unity, was transformed into a site of horror. Rob and Michelle Reiner had been brutally stabbed, and the lives of everyone connected to them were irreversibly altered. For investigators, the challenge was immediate and daunting: to piece together a narrative from chaos, uncover motives, and determine the sequence of events that led to such an unimaginable outcome. The first officers on the scene were met with silence, a tension so thick it seemed to cling to the walls of the sprawling estate. The main house, normally a place of warmth and routine, bore all the hallmarks of violence. Forensic teams documented every detail: the position of the bodies, the distribution of blood spatter, and the state of the living spaces. Each detail would later become crucial in reconstructing the night's events. Investigators often note that the crime scene is not merely a physical location, but a narrative waiting to be decoded. Here, every item, every mark, and every anomaly held the potential to illuminate a story of betrayal, fear, and violence. The presence of Romy, the daughter who discovered the bodies, added another layer of immediacy and emotional complexity. She had stepped into a nightmare that no child should ever encounter, and her first-hand account became central to guiding the initial stages of the investigation. Romy's observations, her identification of a potentially dangerous family member, her immediate call to law enforcement, provided critical leads that helped focus the investigation on Nick, the son residing in the guest house. Her courage under such traumatic circumstances was remarkable, underscoring the human element that is often inseparable from forensic investigation. Forensic teams immediately began cataloging evidence, following protocols designed to preserve the integrity of the scene. Blood patterns were analyzed, weapon trajectories were examined, and the positions of the victims were carefully recorded. Each element offered clues to the sequence of events: the order in which the attacks occurred, the likely movements of the perpetrator, and the degree of premeditation involved. The brutality of the stabbings suggested intent, rather than impulsive reaction, signaling a level of planning that investigators would scrutinize in the days and weeks to come. Law enforcement's attention quickly turned to the guest house where Nick had been living. Proximity alone made it an area of interest, but investigators were guided by more than logistics. They relied on Romy's account, prior family reports, and subtle signs of motive. In cases where family members are suspects, investigators face a dual challenge. The perpetrator is often known to the victims, and the emotional stakes are high for all involved. This adds layers of complexity, as investigators must navigate both forensic evidence and the intricacies of family relationships to uncover truth. Inside the guest house, authorities looked for any signs of preparation or concealment. The goal was to determine whether the attacks were spontaneous, opportunistic, or premeditated. Evidence collection included documenting fingerprints, possible weapon locations, and any digital footprints such as text messages, emails, or call logs. Every interaction, every correspondence became a piece of the puzzle, potentially illuminating Nick's state of mind and the events leading up to the murders. Investigators noted the chilling contrast between the domestic normalcy of the estate and the violent acts that had occurred just steps away. The main house itself offered additional clues. The positions of Rob and Michelle suggested a sudden and personal attack. Blood patterns, trajectory analysis, and the type of injuries indicated the severity and intent behind the stabbings. Each element of the scene was meticulously documented, not only to reconstruct the event, but also to provide evidence for future legal proceedings. Investigators also paid attention to the minutiae: overturned furniture, displaced objects, and subtle signs of struggle. These details often reveal more than initial appearances suggest, providing insight into both the sequence of actions and the emotional intensity of the moment. Digital forensics played a pivotal role. Law enforcement examined phones, computers, and security systems for evidence of communication, planning, or motive. Call logs and messages could provide timestamps and context, offering a window into the emotional state and intentions of the individuals involved. In this case, Rob's final call to Tracy had already become a critical piece of the puzzle, demonstrating his foresight and awareness of potential risk. Investigators sought to corroborate timelines and understand how that warning aligned with the sequence of events that culminated in tragedy. The forensic process also extended to interviewing neighbors and witnesses. In affluent areas like Brentwood, neighbors often notice unusual activity, comings and goings, sounds, or interactions that deviate from the norm. Every piece of external observation contributed to constructing a timeline. This community input is especially valuable when dealing with crimes within prominent families, as it can provide context and corroboration beyond the immediate scene. Throughout the investigation, the emotional weight of the case was omnipresent. Officers and forensic teams, trained to handle trauma, were nonetheless confronted with the horror of a family destroyed from within. The intimate nature of the crime, a parent attacked by their own child, intensified the gravity of each discovery. Investigators were not merely collecting evidence. They were piecing together a narrative that involved profound betrayal, emotional complexity, and human tragedy. As the crime scene investigation progressed, focus inevitably returned to the question of motive. Why would Nick, the son living just steps away in the guest house, allegedly commit such a violent act? Authorities explored financial considerations, psychological dynamics, and family tensions. Rob's explicit warning to Tracy about inheritance provided a crucial lead, suggesting that the potential for conflict over money may have intersected with deeper emotional issues. Motive in familial homicides is rarely simple. It is often a tangled web of resentment, perceived slights, and emotional instability. The collection of evidence at the estate also included analyzing physical barriers, entry points, and security systems. Investigators wanted to determine whether the perpetrator had unrestricted access or if there had been attempts to evade detection. The proximity of the guest house to the main home, combined with the private layout of the estate, created a scenario in which the alleged perpetrator could act swiftly and without interference, a critical consideration in reconstructing the night's events. As investigators pieced together the physical, digital, and testimonial evidence, a narrative began to emerge. The attacks were deliberate, the proximity allowed for immediate access, and the warning previously given by Rob to Tracy indicated an awareness of potential danger. The interplay of premeditation, emotional tension, and opportunity created a scenario in which tragedy became tragically inevitable. Yet, even as evidence mounted, the human story remained central. A family torn apart, a daughter grappling with loss and betrayal, and a community struggling to comprehend violence from within its most intimate unit. The investigation also highlighted the challenges of balancing objectivity with empathy. Law enforcement had to remain detached enough to collect evidence and establish a case, while simultaneously acknowledging the trauma experienced by surviving family members. Romy's account, Tracy's grief, and the public attention all contributed to a charged emotional atmosphere, intensifying the scrutiny and complexity of the investigation. As the first days of the investigation concluded, several critical pieces of evidence were established. The scene confirmed premeditation, the method of attack indicated a personal and violent intent, and the proximity of the suspect, Nick, made him a primary focus. The combination of physical, testimonial, and circumstantial evidence began to paint a picture of what happened that night. Though many questions remained unanswered. What exactly triggered the violence? How long had tensions been simmering? And what could have been done to prevent the tragedy? The crime scene investigation concluded its initial phase, but it set the stage for the larger narrative. Legal proceedings, psychological analysis, and the unraveling of family dynamics that had long been hidden. Every piece of evidence, every observation, every forensic analysis contributed to a deeper understanding of how a night of horror unfolded within the walls of what was supposed to be a safe, loving home. The moment the law enforcement officers placed handcuffs on Nick Reiner, the weight of the tragedy crystallized. What had been a horrific scene inside the Brentwood estate now transformed into a narrative of legal consequence, moral reckoning, and public scrutiny. Nick, the youngest child, the son living in the guest house, was taken into custody the very night his parents were murdered. For the authorities, this arrest was not just procedural. It was the culmination of a night fraught with violence, emotional trauma, and complex family dynamics. From the beginning, the focus on Nick was unavoidable. His proximity to the crime scene, coupled with the warnings his father had given to Tracy, created a compelling, if chilling, context. Officers had to navigate the delicate balance between treating him as a suspect and acknowledging that he was still, in the eyes of many, a human being caught in the crosshairs of circumstance. Every movement, every statement, and every reaction was meticulously observed and documented, forming the foundation for the legal proceedings that would follow. When Nick was read his rights, the gravity of the situation was evident. He was facing 2 counts of first-degree murder, a charge reserved for premeditated, intentional acts of killing. The legal system treats first-degree murder as one of the most serious offenses, often carrying the possibility of life imprisonment or even capital punishment, depending on jurisdiction. In this case, the charges underscored both the severity of the crime and the alleged deliberateness of Nick's actions. First-degree murder is not about impulsive rage. It is about planning, intent, and execution, factors that investigators had already begun to reconstruct based on forensic evidence, witness accounts, and prior knowledge of familial tensions. The arrest itself was quiet, devoid of spectacle, yet laden with symbolism. For law enforcement, it marked the transition from investigation to formal legal process. For the family, it represented a moment of surreal disbelief. The youngest child, the one they had raised, nurtured, and protected, was now accused of committing the most extreme betrayal imaginable. This juxtaposition of parental love and criminal accusation is one of the darkest aspects of familial homicide. It challenges every assumption about safety, trust, and the boundaries of human behavior. Public reaction to the arrest was immediate and intense. The Reiners, known for their prominence and contributions to film and culture, had their private tragedy thrust into the spotlight. Headlines blared the shocking reality: a son accused of murdering his parents, a wealthy family torn apart, a community left in horror.